It was an especially cold winter night in the small village of Hawthorne, an isolated and quiet community on the outskirts of an ancient city. The snow fell heavily, covering everything with a thick, white mantle of silence. The streets were deserted, and only the flickering light from the iron lampposts illuminated the snow-covered paths. The central square, usually bustling with movement and laughter, looked like a scene frozen in time. In the midst of this icy serenity, only one man dared to walk alone through those streets: Carl. Carl was an elderly man, his white hair contrasting with the gray beard that gave him an air of wisdom. He was known to everyone in the village as a man of good heart, always willing to help those in need. In the past, Carl had been the most renowned horse trainer in the region. He had spent decades working on a large farm, taming and caring for the finest animals one could imagine. However, the years had passed, and Carl now lived alone in a modest small house, sustaining himself with a humble pension. Despite his solitary situation, Carl never complained. He was grateful for each day and still kept a vibrant energy in his eyes. His greatest joy came from his weekly visits to the abandoned stable on the outskirts of the village, where a majestic yet forgotten horse lived. The horse, named Valor, was an imposing stallion with a shiny black coat. In the old days, Valor had been the pride of regional races, winning competitions and impressing crowds with his speed and elegance. But time had passed, and now the horse was merely a shadow of his former self. Carl, however, never saw Valor as a forgotten horse. To him, Valor was an old friend, a silent companion who shared his loneliness. Every Sunday, Carl would walk to the stable and bring fresh apples and carrots for Valor. Despite his advanced age, the horse still had a lively gaze and a firm stance, as if, somehow, he were waiting for something. And every time Carl arrived, Valor would whinny softly and shake his head, showing genuine affection for the man who had never abandoned him. For Carl, these visits were more than just a habit. They were moments of tranquility and connection, where he could forget for a few moments the solitude that had accompanied him since his wife's death more than 10 years ago. The horse seemed to understand his pain and, in silence, offered comfort that no words could express. It was as if both shared a mutual understanding of the inevitable losses life brings. But on that particular night, things were about to change. Carl had decided to go to the market, despite the worsening weather, as he needed to buy a few supplies before the snowstorm became too harsh. His thick, worn-out coat barely protected him from the biting cold, and he shivered slightly as he walked through the empty streets. The village looked like a white desert, and the sound of his steps echoed softly, muffled by the falling snow. As Carl made his way through a narrow alley that he usually took as a shortcut to the market, something caught his attention. 3 shadowy figures were standing at the end of the alley. They moved restlessly, like predators circling their prey. Carl hesitated, his heart beating a bit faster. He was not one to scare easily, but there was something menacing about the way these men were watching his path. He took a step back, thinking about turning around, but before he could react, one of the men stepped forward, blocking his way. He was a tall, thin man with a malicious smile and eyes that gleamed like those of a hungry wolf. His accomplices, 2 burly men with rough appearances, slowly moved in, surrounding Carl as if they were savoring the growing fear of the old man. "Well, look what we have here," the tall man exclaimed, his voice dripping with venom. "An old man walking alone on a night like this. Is he lost, I wonder?" Carl felt his heart tighten, but he tried to remain calm. He knew he had nothing of value with him, just a few coins and a scribbled shopping list. But it was clear that these men didn't care about money. They wanted to inflict pain. They wanted to see the suffering on the face of someone defenseless. "I'm just heading to the market," Carl responded, trying to sound confident. "I have nothing you would want. Please, leave me alone." The 3 men laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls of the alley. The tall man took a step forward and pushed Carl against the icy wall. The old man whimpered softly, pain shooting through his frail shoulders. He tried to remain strong, but he could feel his strength draining rapidly. "We've decided that you owe us a little toll," said the man, a sinister smile on his lips. "And I think tonight we'll take our payment in the form of a bit of fun." Carl knew what that tone meant. His blood ran cold. He tried to pull away, but the other two men grabbed him forcefully, holding him in place. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing and the harsh wind whistling through the alley. Then, a distant sound cut through the silence, a loud, powerful neigh. Carl froze. That sound, he knew that neigh. It was Valor, but the horse was supposed to be in the stable, miles away. How could he be here? The leader of the gang turned, frowning in confusion. Carl's eyes widened with hope. Valor was here, somehow sensing that his old friend was in danger. And in that moment, something changed. Like a shadow in the darkness, a black silhouette emerged at the entrance of the alley, thundering through the snow with a force that seemed impossible for a horse of his age. It was Valor, his powerful body dusted with snow, his eyes burning with a fury Carl had never seen before. The stallion, usually so calm and serene, now looked like a force of nature, a wild spirit coming to protect his friend. The three men stood still, disbelieving. One of them let go of Carl, stepping back. But it was too late. Valor neighed again, louder this time, a sound that echoed like thunder, and then charged forward with astonishing speed, each hoofbeat sending up sprays of snow in the icy air. Carl, still trembling, felt a surge of hope. But what could Valor do? How could a horse face three armed men? He wouldn't have to wonder for long, because what happened next would forever be etched in the memories of everyone in that small village. The gang leader spun around quickly, raising his hands as if he could stop the horse with a simple gesture. But Valor did not hesitate. The stallion stormed forward with a furious gallop, muscles tense and chest heaving like a storm about to break. He neighed loudly, a sound that echoed through the narrow alley, making the men tremble. The first blow came fast. Valor raised his front legs and slammed them onto the ground in front of the tall man, sending snow and shards of ice flying in every direction. The two thugs who were holding Carl instantly released him and backed away, their faces twisted in fear. They had never seen a horse so large, so imposing, especially at this time of night. It was as if a mythological creature had emerged from the shadows to demand retribution for their cruel acts. The leader stepped back, stumbling in the snow, trying to maintain his composure, but his wide eyes betrayed his terror. "Come on, it's just an old horse," he shouted, trying to rally his men, but his voice sounded shaky, unsure. One of the thugs, younger and clearly less courageous, was already beginning to inch away, his eyes fixed on Valor. The horse shook his head from side to side, snorting furiously. His eyes locked onto the aggressors as if daring them to make a move. Then, with a sudden motion, Valor lunged forward again, forcing the men to scatter. The second thug, a burly man with arms as thick as tree trunks, tried to rise and yelled, "Let's take him down!" But before he could act, Valor was in front of him. With impressive precision, the horse turned, using his powerful hind legs to deliver a kick that narrowly missed the man's chest, knocking him down into the snow with a thud that made the air rush out of his lungs. The thug lay on the ground, coughing and gasping for breath, his eyes wide with shock. Carl, still leaning against the wall, felt his body trembling. But this time, it wasn't just from fear. It was a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had never imagined that Valor, that old horse who had always shown such serenity and gentleness, could exhibit such courage and ferocity. But here he was, defending his friend with a fury that seemed to defy the very nature of a horse. The gang leader, still stunned, tried to pull out a knife he had hidden in his coat. He pointed it at Valor, his eyes filled with rage and desperation. "Get away from here, you damned beast!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the alley. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Carl felt his heart stop. But before he could cry out or react, Valor stepped forward, his massive body blocking Carl's view like a living shield. He neighed again, a sound so powerful that it made the leader flinch instinctively. Then, almost supernaturally, Valor took another leap, moving with a swiftness that no one expected from a horse of his age. The knife fell to the ground, sliding through the snow, as the man tried to shield himself with his raised arms. But Valor didn't strike him directly. Instead, he stopped just inches away, snorting and pawing at the ground with his front hooves, as if daring the man to try again. The gang leader, completely terrified, scrambled back, stumbling and falling onto his back in the snow. He looked up, seeing only the massive form of Valor, towering over him against the dim glow of the streetlights. The horse's eyes were like burning coals, full of determination and a strength that seemed to transcend mere animal instinct. Let's get out of here," the leader shouted, his voice now full of panic. The other two men, who had managed to recover, didn't need any further encouragement. They ran as if they had seen a demon. The leader scrambled to his feet, still slipping and sliding in the thick snow, and followed his lackeys, disappearing into the darkness of the alley, their boots crunching and sinking in the heavy snow. Carl, who had remained motionless throughout the entire scene, finally managed to breathe. His chest heaved, his heart pounding like a drum in his ears. He looked at Valor, still disbelieving. The horse remained there, standing, watching the end of the alley where the men had fled, like a guardian ensuring that the threat was truly gone. "Valor," Carl murmured, his voice hoarse and filled with emotion. "How?" The horse then slowly turned, his eyes glowing softly as he approached Carl. He lowered his head and gently nudged Carl's shoulder with his muzzle, as if comforting him. Carl raised a trembling hand and stroked Valor's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's skin beneath the thick fur. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over him, and tears began to stream down his wrinkled face. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice choked. "Just like you've always saved my spirit with your presence." For a few moments, the old man and the horse stood there, motionless in the silent alley, surrounded by snow and the soft glow of the village lights. It was as if the rest of the world had disappeared, and only they existed in that instant. Carl realized that Valor, somehow, had always known he needed protection, not just physically, but emotionally. The horse hadn't just driven away those men. He had reminded Carl that even in the deepest darkness, there was still light and true friendship. After a few minutes, Carl knew they needed to leave. He quickly wiped away his tears and looked around. The houses were silent, and no one seemed to have witnessed what had happened. He took one last glance at the end of the alley, where the men had disappeared, and then turned his attention back to Valor. "Let's go home, my friend," he said softly. Valor tilted his head as if agreeing, and together they began to walk slowly through the snow-covered streets. The horse trotted beside Carl, each step firm and steady, as if he were ready to face whatever might come next. As they made their way through the sleeping village, Carl couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. He knew that the story of an old horse defending an elderly man would sound absurd to anyone who hadn't seen it, but for him, it was proof that true bonds transcend any limit. It didn't matter the age, the time, or the distance. Valor had sensed his fear and had come to his aid. And that night, Carl understood that just as he had never abandoned Valor, the horse would never let him face life's challenges alone. The next morning, the entire village was buzzing with rumors. News about the incident spread quickly. Someone had found the discarded knife and noticed the unusual horse tracks in the alley. Soon, everyone was talking about what had happened. The details became exaggerated as the story made its rounds. Some claimed Carl had bravely fought off the men himself, while others swore they had heard Valor neigh so loudly that the sound reverberated through the nearby mountains. Carl, however, remained silent. He had no interest in being the center of attention. What had happened the previous night was far more than a mere street altercation. To him, it symbolized something deeper, the strength of the bond that he and Valor had built over the years. Even now, as he sat in his rocking chair on the porch, looking at the horse grazing peacefully in the small field behind his house, Carl felt a renewed respect for his old friend. But the events of that night were far from over. By late morning, while Carl was feeding Valor, he heard the sound of hooves approaching along the main road. He turned, surprised, and saw 3 riders coming toward the stable. The men, all well-dressed and carrying themselves with an air of authority, dismounted and walked directly towards Carl and Valor. One of them, clearly the leader, a middle-aged man with a distinguished hat and neatly trimmed mustache, stared straight at Carl with a serious expression. "Are you Carl, the former horse trainer?" the man asked bluntly. Carl nodded slowly, his eyes assessing each of the newcomers. He could feel the tension in the air. Who were these men, and why were they here? "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The leader glanced at Valor, who stood quietly nearby, his muscles ready for any sudden movement. Even in his usual calm demeanor, there was something in the horse's posture that clearly communicated, "I'm watching you." "I heard that there was an incident in the village last night," said the man, crossing his arms. "A powerful black horse attacked 3 men who were harassing a resident. Is this the horse in question?" He pointed to Valor. Carl felt his stomach tighten. So they knew. The news had traveled fast, and these men weren't here out of curiosity. "Yes, it was him," Carl replied, his voice steady but cautious. "But he only did it to protect me. Those men were trying to hurt me." The leader looked back at Valor, and Carl noticed a calculating gleam in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if appraising a valuable piece of art. "Well, that's interesting. Very interesting indeed. I'm Edgar Marsh, the owner of one of the largest racehorse ranches in the city. And this horse," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "he's exactly the kind of animal I've been looking for. You know, a horse with that spirit, that loyalty. He would be worth a fortune. I've heard he belongs to an old, abandoned stable with no official owner. What do you say to selling him?" The offer caught Carl off guard. He blinked, confused, trying to absorb the words. Sell Valor? The idea seemed absurd. Valor wasn't just any horse. He was a friend, a companion. How could someone suggest such a thing? "No, absolutely not," Carl replied, his voice now full of resolve. "Valor is not for sale." But Edgar only smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Oh, don't be so hasty. I can offer a generous amount. I know your financial situation isn't the best, Carl. I can pay you enough to live comfortably for the rest of your days." Carl felt a mix of anger and disbelief. This man understood nothing. It wasn't about money. It had never been. Valor was more than a racehorse. He was the last link to Carl's past, to the days when he felt alive and purposeful. "I said no," Carl repeated, stepping closer to Valor. "He's not for sale, no matter what you offer." Edgar's eyes narrowed, and the smile vanished from his lips. "Well, that's a shame. A horse like this, wasted here, it's truly unfortunate." With that, Edgar gestured to the other 2 men, who exchanged uneasy glances. They seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but followed orders without question. The 3 mounted their horses and slowly rode away. "I'll be back, Carl," Edgar called over his shoulder. "I'll give you some time to reconsider. Think it over. You could do something good for this horse. Put him back on the racetrack. Think of the glories he could achieve again, and how much you could gain from it." Carl didn't respond. He just stood there, watching them disappear down the road. When they were gone, he turned to Valor and sighed heavily. The horse shook his head, as if sensing that something important had just happened. Carl patted his neck, feeling the familiar warmth under the thick mane. "Don't worry, my friend. I won't let them take you, no matter what they say." But in the following days, the pressure grew. Edgar kept his word and returned several times, each time with a higher offer, each time with more persuasive arguments. He brought other men, horse experts, who examined Valor from a distance, making notes and whispering among themselves. Carl felt the discomfort rising. He knew Valor was safe as long as he was by his side, but what if they decided to use more aggressive means? What if they tried to take Valor by force? Then, one night, as Carl was feeding Valor, he heard a creak at the gate. His body tensed. Valor also lifted his head, his ears alert. Carl's heart began to pound faster. Someone was outside. He quickly extinguished the lantern and moved silently to the window. The darkness hid the details, but he could see the silhouettes of 3 men sneaking through the side gate of the stable. They carried ropes and something that gleamed under the moonlight, a syringe. Panic surged through Carl. They had come to take Valor. He knew he had to act fast. If they managed to sedate Valor, they would capture him without a struggle. Swallowing his fear, Carl moved closer to the horse and whispered urgently, "Valor, we have to get out of here. Now." Valor looked at him, his eyes calm but alert, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Carl grabbed a bridle and, with shaking hands, slipped it over Valor's head. He had never planned to ride again. His body was old, his strength faded, but there was no other choice. It was now or never. With a deep breath, Carl swung himself onto Valor's back. The pain shot through his legs and spine, but he clenched his teeth, ignoring it. "Let's show them what you're made of, Valor," he murmured, gripping the reins tightly. "Run like the wind, my friend." Valor's ears flicked back, his body tensing. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the stallion sprang forward, charging out of the stable like a bolt of black lightning. Carl's grip tightened on the reins as Valor charged out of the stable, snow scattering in every direction. The 3 men barely had time to react. The first tried to throw a rope, but Valor moved too quickly, dodging the lasso as if it were nothing. Carl held his breath, his heart racing. The thugs scrambled to mount their horses, their shouts growing louder as they set off in pursuit. Valor galloped through the snow-covered field, the cold wind biting at Carl's face. The other horses, younger and faster, closed in steadily. Carl knew they couldn't outrun them for long, but if they could just make it to the nearby woods, he might have a chance to lose them in the dense trees. "Hold on, Valor," he urged, guiding the horse toward a narrow trail at the forest's edge. With a powerful leap, Valor burst into the woods. The men followed, but Carl navigated the twisting path with a skill born from a lifetime of experience. Branches whipped at his face, and snow fell in thick clumps, but he pushed Valor on, weaving through the trees. "Don't let them get away," one of the riders yelled, his voice echoing through the dark forest. Carl glanced over his shoulder. The men were closing in, their horses slipping and struggling to keep up. Just a bit further, he spotted a thick cluster of bushes up ahead, the perfect spot to hide. "There, boy," Carl whispered, pulling the reins sharply. Valor responded instantly, ducking behind the bushes and coming to a silent halt. Carl held his breath as the pursuers thundered past, oblivious to their hiding spot. Moments later, the forest grew quiet again. Carl let out a long, shaky breath and patted Valor's neck. "We did it, my friend," he murmured softly. "We lost them." But he knew it was only temporary. Edgar Marsh would keep hunting them, and they couldn't keep running forever. Looking up at the moonlit sky, Carl made a decision. There was an old family cabin deep in the mountains, hidden from prying eyes. If they could reach it, they could finally be safe. "It's time to disappear for good," he whispered. With one last glance at the now empty path, Carl turned Valor towards the distant peaks. Side by side, they began the long journey into the heart of the mountains, seeking the peace and freedom they both deserved. Months passed since Carl and Valor vanished into the mountains. The village of Hawthorne still whispered about the mysterious disappearance of the elderly man and his black stallion. Some believed Carl had run away to protect his friend. Others thought he might have finally sold Valor to avoid trouble. But no one really knew what had become of them. Far away, hidden deep in the rugged wilderness, Carl and Valor found their sanctuary. The old family cabin, tucked between thick pine trees and nestled at the foot of a majestic mountain, became their safe haven. It was a simple place, but it offered them the freedom they had fought so hard to protect. Carl would watch Valor gallop across the open fields, the horse's mane flowing in the wind, his spirit unbroken and wild. The man's heart, which had once been heavy with loneliness, now felt light. In this secluded paradise, he rediscovered the joy of life, far from the clutches of greed and violence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky with hues of orange and gold, Carl sat by Valor's side, running his fingers through the horse's thick mane. "I thought I was keeping you safe," Carl murmured softly. "But the truth is, you've given me something far more valuable. You saved me from a life without purpose." Valor, as if understanding, gently nudged Carl's shoulder, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the setting sun. Carl smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. They might have left the world behind, but in the quiet solitude of the mountains, they had found something far more precious: a home, a bond that nothing could break, and the freedom to live their days side by side. Because true friendship, Carl realized, was never about owning or possessing. It was about loyalty, courage, and the unspoken promise to always stand by each other, no matter the cost. And so, Carl and Valor lived out the rest of their days in peace, a legendary pair known only in whispers and distant memories, free and untamed as the wind that swept through their hidden mountain refuge.